Thank you so very much for joining us this afternoon for what I know all of us believe is going to be a very special presentation by a very special visitor to our city and to our campus. This afternoon's lecture is co-sponsored by UTEP Center for Inter-American and Border Studies, and we thank the center and its executive director, Ricardo Velasquez, for their participation today. The theme of this year's Millennium Lecture Series is Contemporary Issues, and we're focusing this fall on Latin America. We've invited distinguished speakers to share with us their perspectives on critical issues that are likely to shape the future of our society for generations to come. UTEP's location on the border and our position in this intricately interrelated community places us squarely in the mainstream of important inter-American socio-political dynamics. We're honored to have as our speaker today a noted expert on Latin American political, economic, and humanitarian conditions, Dr. Diana Negroponte. Dr. Negroponte is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution specializing in Latin America. She earned her doctorate from Georgetown University. Her dissertation examined the struggle for peace in El Salvador. Dr. Negroponte received a bachelor's degree from the London School of Economics and a law degree from American University's Washington College of Law. She has studied in Mexico City and Paris and has taught at Georgetown and Fordham universities. In the 1980s and again in 1997, Dr. Negroponte practiced law in Washington, D.C., specializing in international trade and aviation law. She has also worked with the American Chamber of Commerce in Mexico City as the North American Free Trade Agreement was under development. Dr. Negroponte recently served as a senior scholar at the United States Institute of Peace. She is a board member of the Women's Foreign Policy Group and the Council on the National Endowment for the Humanities, and is a member of Amnesty International and the Council on Foreign Relations. She is also a member of the Board of Directors of Opportunity International, which provides microfinancing opportunities to people working to escape poverty, and is chair of its Women's Opportunity Network. Dr. Negroponte's most recent Brookings Institution monograph, The Mérida Initiative and Central America, The Challenges of Containing Public Insecurity and Criminal Violence, considers the reasons for structural instability and increased violence in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and these governments and Mexico's calls upon Washington for assistance. While this work is focused on situations in the Northern Triangle of Central America, its conclusions about contributing social and criminal factors have deep relevance to our closest neighbor as well. As we in the UTEP community contemplate the apparent entrenchment of unprecedented levels of violence and disruption of day-to-day life in Juarez and the rest of Mexico, Dr. Negroponte's frank and considered views are relevant and extremely timely. Please join me now in extending a very warm UTEP welcome to a very special guest and good friend, Dr. Diana Negroponte.
Dr. Natalicio, members of the faculty and staff at UTEP, thank you for a wonderful welcome today. It's always good to come down to some good sunshine, a little bit of desert life. And I have to tell you that I like looking across the fence. I like looking southward, and I only wish I could be there. I'm going to spend the next about 40 minutes looking at an area which is much closer than this map would suggest. And that's because organized crime no longer stays within the barrier, nor within the country, and nor within the region. The syndicates of criminal behavior are now global. The leaders have MBAs, and have usually a legal front, real estate business, dry cleaners, behind which they then trade in women, automobiles, spare parts, guns, drugs, you can think of it. So although my focus is on 3 countries in Central America, Guatemala, Salvador, and Honduras, with continual reference to Nicaragua and Costa Rica, the analysis, I believe, is applicable in Mexico. Now, I'm testing this because this is the present work that I'm doing. But we're going to, in the question and answer session, see whether the hypothesis that holds for Central America also applies to Mexico or not. When I show this photograph in New York, people retch. When I show a photograph like this here in El Paso, it's the norm. Because you live so close to the violence. For you, the violence of 300 intentional homicides a month is becoming an average. And that is the extraordinary phenomena for you, and one which further north, be it in Washington or Chicago, Minnesota or in New York, is something we reject. But the reason that I have this up on the screen is that the numbers counted in per 100,000, 62 per 100,000 in Salvador. What is it for Guatemala? 38. These are way in excess of the USA. USA, believe it or not, we think we're pretty violent, but we're in the range 6 to 7 per 100,000. These numbers are equivalent to areas in civil wars, and they're increasing. I put this slide up because I want you to look at the trend. I want you to look at that trend of Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, which may be flattening somewhat now, but has not yet begun to decrease. And then I want you to compare it with 2 countries at the bottom of the chart, Nicaragua and Costa Rica. Why have they avoided those levels of violence that have affected the countries to the north? Why have they managed to hold an integrated community and protect themselves against the pandillas, or maras as they're called further north, or organized crime? Nicaragua had a civil war. So the explanation that countries which have suffered civil wars, such as Guatemala and Salvador, which produced among the generation which is your contemporaries, men and women who grew up and went to school with bodies in the street. That violence, that exposure to violence from a very young age, together with the fact that the men in the family went off to fight, either with the government forces or with the guerrilla forces, meant that young men and women were being brought up with violence around them as well as violence within the family. Mothers, to survive, had different lovers. The lovers were not necessarily kind to the children of another man. So kids had to tolerate sexual abuse, either on themselves or seeing it carried out against their mother. And the result of this is a generation for whom violence is the norm, you have no trust in another human being, and you have deep skepticism of any sense of authority. Now, that could explain Guatemala, Salvador, high numbers. Honduras never had a civil war, although it was dragged in to Salvador's war to a degree. And it was dragged into Nicaragua. But Nicaragua doesn't have those numbers. What occurred in Nicaragua is that social committees were formed within the barrios. And the heads of those committees kept an eye, or maybe spied, on fellow members of the community. Now that has a negative connotation for us today. You don't spy on them. But in the Sandinista regime of the 1980s, that observation of your neighbors ensured that everybody behaved in a certain way. That same culture of observation may have endured to the point that that community expects a civil behavior within the community, and where it does not exist, where there are young men or young women who are breaking the community tradition, they're pointed out, they're arrested, they're removed. But there's another one. The Nicaraguan police have a different attitude towards young criminals than in the other countries. They are trained in accommodating the young to their adventures, their various behaviors. So what you'll find with the Nicaraguan police is they'll very often beat up a 15-year-old at the time of the robbery, the assault, but they won't take them to jail. So retribution is carried out, not necessarily fairly, but it's carried out on the spot, and that young person is not then removed to a place called jail, but which I will argue has become a recruiting center for maras, youth gangs, pandillas, and later on, organized criminals. Girls want to join gangs. It's cool. To get into the gang, girls have two methods. One is gang rape, but thereafter you are treated as a whore. Or a girl will accept the same 13 seconds of beating by her homies. They're the tough ones. They're the ones who survive. So for 13 seconds, you will be kicked, beaten, in your stomach, in your head, on your breasts, whatever part those homies wish to hurt you. And at the end of the 30 seconds in which you may not cry out, you may not scream, you may not whimper, they help you out and they congratulate you. The very people who beat you now become your homies, your family, your group. And that is how a girl enters the Maya. This is now possible because femicide is declining. Femicide is the murder of a woman. And until 2004, in Guatemala, to be accepted within the gang, the initiation rite, the hazing, required the rape, disfigurement, and murder of a woman. But the gangs realized that they were just alienating alienating the very women who could be useful to them within the gang. So they have stopped that, at least as an initiation, right? And what we're seeing as a result is girls seeking to enter the gang, but they are never treated as equals. They are never considered to be fully gang members. They are always, in some ways, subservient to the male members. I'm going to spend a little while still focused on the maras. I'm focusing for a while on the maras because this, in many ways, is the base within the community who joins these illegal gangs, and which later then develops into the criminal organizations. And I'm not forgetting the cartels who will use the gangs to carry out their dirty work. But let's start on gangs. Gangs are horizontal. You'll have your senior homie, but there isn't the kind of structure that we expect in a corporation or we expect in an organized international criminal network. One gang is necessarily hostile to another gang. One gang possesses, patrols a certain area of town, and anybody else who enters into it is hurt. So you defend territory. You defend territory, you protect each other, and loyalty above all things is essential. Loyalty to your gang, to your mara, and to your homies. Which means if you're picked up by the police, and you're bound to be picked up by the police because you are identified so clearly by your tattoos, you can talk about all things except your fellow gang members. Their names, their whereabouts, what they have done. Silence. And if you spit to the police, your relatives get hurt. So there is a cohesion among them. I like the railroad here. I like the railroad because it suggests to me that migration is such an important part of criminal enterprise. Migration northward, money coming and arms coming southward. Continual movement. Actually, it's become circular. Because after 2004, the United States started deporting young men and women from Central America in much higher numbers. We were approximately at 20,000 per year until 2004, and we are now at, last year was 74,000. So far this year, as of September, we were at 72,100 young men and women who went up to the United States with their parents at the end of one of the civil wars. They may have been 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years old when they went up. They have no knowledge of their own communities, their own villages. And when they're deported, they are dumped down at the airport and left on their own. Now, they may be told that there's a cousin in Morazan province, but there is a family, but that person is distant. Whereas there is an immediate family pretty close to the airport. And the maras will come and embrace them, give them a family, something to eat, a job to do. And so by deporting young men and women in the quantities that the United States government is now doing, only 21% of which have a criminal record we are exacerbating the problem of Mara gang violence. I found this story. He was 24. He'd been a member of the gang for quite a while. What he doesn't have is the pearls on the edge of his eye. Pearls indicate a homicide. And for each homicide, you carry a mark of great respect for the gang, but obviously an indication to the police that you are a criminal. Bolaños wanted to enter organized crime. He'd had enough of this baby stuff, Mara stuff. You enter the Maras roughly around 11, 12 years old. By 24, you've grown up. And so his aspirations were to join organized criminal enterprises, hierarchically organized, with links to other criminal enterprises throughout the hemisphere, trading in arms, drugs, cigarettes, pharmaceuticals, women, cars, car parts. That is what he told the police when they arrested him. I wanted something bigger. I wanted something more sophisticated. So we've seen graduation from Maras into something more sophisticated, and so far much harder to deal with. There is a country which has experienced the same level of intentional homicide, kidnapping, extortion, robbery, and that's Colombia. In the 1990s, Colombia was torn apart with levels of violence which occur in Juarez, which occur in San Salvador, Guatemala City. The rate of intentional homicides was a little higher than Salvador's today. And people were fleeing Colombia, Cali, Medellin, in the same way as they flee Juarez. Those who could, most can't. In the same way as President Calderón approached President Bush in the town of Mérida in March 2007, President Pastrana approached Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, in '98 and said, "Will you work with us?" And the US committed $1.3 billion, just a little bit less than Bush committed to Calderón, to work with the Colombian military, police, and justice system to seek to end or contain the violence. Now, whereas the United States put in a total of $4 billion between 2000 and 2005, the Colombian government put in $7 billion. They increased by 30% revenues devoted to the military, the police, and the justice. And recently, the Colombian people have accepted a wealth tax, 2007 to 2011, in which the wealthiest members of Colombian society will raise $3.7 billion for social programs. They're not being asked to contribute towards the military aspect or the police. They are being asked, and they're paying up on social and economic programs. Because if one of the causes of this violence is dysfunctional families, and combine it with school, which is dull, beyond work, such that few stay beyond 4th grade. And even if you stay, you go for the morning so that you can register and then you've gone. But no schooling means no skills, and no skills means poorly paid jobs. And when you hit an economic recession like you have at the moment, those with poor skills get no jobs, at least not legally. So Colombian society has agreed to pay this tax in order to improve the education, in order for companies to agree to hire young men and women who have left criminal enterprises. It's tough for those young men. I've met with them. From a life of crime but a degree of freedom, they're up at 4 in the morning working at a bakery. That's not funny. But it is a life where they do not have that same level of fear, and where they can start bringing up the kids that their girlfriend and themselves have dedicated to. That recreation of a life after gang life, criminal life, FARC life, AUL life, insurgent life, is what is happening in Colombia today, such that the town of Medellin is now free for tourists like me to go and wander around and go up into Santo Domingo, areas where I would never have gone in the 1990s and the early part of 2000. But now, policemen walk around with one sidearm and no bulletproof vests and no helmet. So it can be done. The Colombians have done it. It's not perfect, it's not over, but it requires a decade-long commitment by the whole of society to engage in education programs, social programs, as well as the training of police and the courts. I'm going to move now to my second part, which is going to be a bit more technical, so I'm going to take a swig of water. It's the legal part. Have you ever heard of telephone justice? Telephone justice is where a notable member in the community, one of his sons or a cousin, is picked up for illegal behavior. And on this, a notable man picks up his cell and he calls the judge. Señor juez, sí, lo siento mucho, un accidente, pero gracias, muchas gracias. And the young man's let out the next day. But Pedro, who has no contacts, has no powerful sponsor, is picked up for stealing 3 loaves of bread in the market in San Salvador. One for his mother, one for his sister, one for him. He stays in jail, and despite the constitutional requirement that he should be presented in front of a magistrate within 24 hours, he's there for months, and his case is forgotten about. So in a society which knows that the rich get away, the rich and the powerful get away, because they have powerful sponsors, they know the right people, there is a fundamental lack of trust in the judiciary. A fundamental skepticism that judges or prosecutors are there to serve people, but rather to serve the wealthy. miserable trust. Miserable trust. Somewhat higher in Salvador, but otherwise at levels, this is percentages on the side, which we would find very difficult to accept. But compare that with Colombia, where you're in the 60% now, didn't used to be, now 60% trust in the judges and in the court. It's taken 15 years, but it's worth continuing. The trust is not only based on the fact that one kind of justice for those in power and another kind of justice for others, but it's also based on a concern of the sheer incompetence of the legal system. Traditionally, your case was heard by a fiscal, a prosecutor, who wrote by hand what the police or the neighbors or whatever other witness told him or her. And slowly the file got heavier. Nobody else looked at the file. Then the file got lost. Or evidence was miscreated, or property was seized, or bank accounts were lost. But it was a system in which incompetence verging on the deliberate, and by deliberate I mean corruption, had become the norm. So in 1980, a Chilean and an Argentinian jurist determined to change that whole system. And they determined that a system based on a presumption of innocence, the ability of the person charged to challenge his or her case with the help of a public defender, for the cases to be heard in public, and for determination to be made by fellow citizens. Now, for those of us brought up in an Anglo-Saxon system, this is the norm. But if you've come from this to a modern system, it takes a little while. Judges don't like giving up their prerogatives. Politicians who nominate the judges don't like giving up their influence. Presidents who make the final decision on the naming for the Supreme Court have found it quite useful to have this patronage system over the courts. And so these reforms directly engaged in the nature of society, such that a patrimonial society where one person protects another, and in exchange for which that person votes for him, helps him, is shifted, maybe permanently, to one of individual rights. You are responsible for what you do, not anybody else, and where the rule of law matters rather than patrons or powerful sponsors. Now that shift takes time. And I would argue that it's a shift which is happening very slowly in Mexico. That the change from the pre-sponsorship of individuals who in turn had patronage over others in exchange for the vote was disrupted when President Cedillo allowed the PRI to lose, and political change slowly entered Mexican life. But this change has come with many different earthquaking shakes to the system. Because if I've got used to always going to licenciado to protect me, to find a job for me, to get my son out of jail, when that system can no longer respond to me, when licenciado says, I'm sorry, I can't do it anymore, you know, the old structure has gone, you have to look after yourself. That individual responsibility takes time to absorb. You were the generation who are going to make it happen. You are the generation who are ready to say, I'm ready to take responsibility for myself. I'm ready to go out based on my skills and competence and work habits to get my jobs. But you're the first generation to be doing it. And meantime, your parents' generation is saying, don't worry, Jose. Don't worry, Mary. We'll ask your uncle. We'll ask a patron to find you work. It's not going to happen. But the shift in your life in finding a job and getting further education, the shift in having an independent, transparent judiciary based on the rule of law is very slow. I think we've talked about most of what is there, but what you're going to see, and I want to note, is Costa Rica. Costa Rica has succeeded in achieving a level of trust in the judiciary and a respect for independence that we're not seeing in any of the other countries of the hemisphere. And yet if Costa Rica can do it, why can't the others? Why can't the others succeed in creating a justice system whereby fellow lawyers select those men and women with the values and the competence to be our judges? Why can't those countries stop this dependence on legislators and senior members of government to appoint favorites and to reject political enemies? If Costa Rica can achieve that degree of respect, the skills, education, honesty, then surely the other countries can too. And I am confident that over time they will do so. But I do think that there's a role in which the American Bar Association, which the Association of American Judges can help if called upon. We should never impose, but if asked, we should be ready to share practices which help achieve independence within the American judiciary. But we're not there yet. Why I'm putting this up is I chose 2 years, 2006 and 2008. My concern is that there's a greater willingness to bribe in 2008 than there was in 2006. Are our societies becoming more corrupt? I would suggest that our government institutions have become weaker. That it's not just judges or prosecutors or clerks of the court who can be bought, but that our political parties, our politicians, are people who are increasingly viewed with a degree of contempt. They are not admirable leaders of society, but are seen as people who are only in it for personal reward. Or, and another very important part of public insecurity, is that the individuals appointed to positions or elected to positions of authority fear confronting gangs, organized crime, or the cartels. The fear element is very important. You can have a municipal authority who is an upright man or woman. They know what is the moral and virtuous decision to make. But they also know that if they do not comply with what the organized, illicit, crime belt wishes, their mothers will be murdered, their children will be kidnapped, their wives will be brutalized. There's no money in that, just fear, raw fear. And that is the concern when we talk about failing states. When we start wondering whether the institutions of government can still continue to serve you and me and the authorities, when we wonder whether they can do it, it's because levels of fear have decreased to the point that good men and women are frightened to take the right decision. You know the story in Morelia, where La Familia told the Red Cross, when you get the telephone call saying that there has been a confrontation, there are bodies on the ground at a certain place, you must wait 20 minutes before leaving the Red Cross headquarters. And if you leave before 20 minutes, and therefore arrive on the scene and able to provide life support, we will break into your offices, Red Cross, and we will break up every piece of furniture and hurt every living person within it. So, just wait 20 minutes, that's all. So that when the ambulance arrives on the scene, it's too late. He or she won't live. Now that is a recurrent theme, which undermines the effectiveness of the Red Cross. But start duplicating that in so many different ways that you know in your life, and you realize that people start living differently, where fear becomes a permanent. And in this permanent fear and distrust of politicians, the police, the Red Cross. Well, why not bribe? After all, if you get a lesser sentence, it's worth it. In the face of this fear, where men and women knew that as they went to work on the bus, they would be robbed of their iPod, if they had one, their shoes, their watches, the citizens of Central America took to the streets. In the same way as the citizens of Mexico City, dressed in white, and they took to the streets. And the immediate response was mano dura. New legislation making it an offense to be a member of the gang, up to 12 years in jail for merely having the tattoos or the hand signals that went with it. It worked for about 19 months. About 19 months, the situation calmed down somewhat. They dragged in, sort of net-like dragging in of young men, put them all in jail, take them off the street. But you can't keep them in jail forever. After all, if the only crime is association with the gangs, you don't remain in jail forever. This isn't a capital case. But it was sufficient time for the men and the women to become trained. Because cell phones are easily available. Prostitution rackets, extortion rackets, they're all run from jail. And so what Mano Dura did, this hard-fisted attempt to control crime, was exacerbate. Just make it worse. Just ensure that people had a better chance to become trained, get to know, in overcrowded facilities, where for those young men and women a period in jail was considered the norm. No one stayed very long, but there was good acquaintanceship made, alliances made, and deals continued to be carried out. Jails built for 8,000 regularly had 3 times the number. International organizations would go in, would campaign. How did it affect? So last week in Guatemala, they moved 7 key criminal leaders to a new top security jail. The criminals or the organized gangs didn't like that. So as these 7 are being moved to Franjitas, they murder 3 policemen and wound 2 others. Now, if that was the only time, you'd say, well, part of life. This was the 11th time that this had happened since July. In other words, whenever they sought to move high-value criminals to a new and special jail, the word was out when a move was going to take place, and the police who moved them were disposed of. They couldn't do anything in Guatemala until February of 2008. February 2008, the criminal organizations targeted bus drivers. Now, a bus driver had to provide so much money per week, and if not, he was murdered. And in the course of a 15-day period, 27 bus drivers were murdered. They went on strike. They said, ya, no más. And the bus drivers of Guatemala City brought the capital, the economy, to a grinding halt. And at that moment, the Guatemalan government came to realize that unless they brought in changes, they could no longer protect citizens. But the Guatemalan Congress and its government recognized they couldn't do it on its own. And in an extraordinary admission of weakness, the weakness of the state to keep citizens safe, the government of Samuel Berga invited the United Nations in to form a commission of 50 prosecutors, Spanish-speaking prosecutors, from all over the world, who had no family or connections in Guatemala and therefore could carry out the investigations and the prosecutions in an honest and impartial and independent way. The Commission Against Corruption and Impunity in Guatemala is called CICIG, C-I-C-I-G. It's been extended beyond its original 2 years because Guatemalan politicians and leaders recognize that on their own they cannot keep Guatemalan people safe. They cannot protect those who travel by bus to work or the bus drivers themselves. So what about those police right up against us there? I must speed up a bit too. Very little confidence. World Bank indicators the only country with a slight confidence in the police is Honduras, but for the rest, dismal. This issue of the lack of security was raised in June at a meeting of the OAS in Honduras. And these big advertisements were plastered all over San Pedro Sula, identifying that crime and insecurity had become unacceptable, but how to resolve it. How did you become like this young man? A man who has removed his tattoos, who's left the gangs, and who has the certificate indicating that he is now a regular member of society with a Carta de Libertad. That's what we want for everybody. But how to get there is the challenge. So I'm very briefly just going to identify what's in this package. A very small amount of money, but at least an initial effort on the United States government point of view to support efforts within those countries. We must train police. We have to train police in investigation, in patrolling communities, in establishing trust with the very people that you're working with. Police need equipment. It's no good if you don't have a radio. If you haven't got fingerprinting devices, if you haven't got computers, your capacity to be able to track criminals is minimal. Judges need training. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, clerks of the courts, all need training. But that has to be training in the law and in the practice of those countries, and in an effective manner. Witness protection would be wonderful to introduce, but it's very expensive. And finally, and extremely important, we need to find the money to invest in education, skills training, employment opportunities, and alternative lifestyle. Because if I've only got one choice, go hungry or join the gang, or even worse, my kids or my younger brothers go hungry, or I join the gang, I probably join. So alternative livelihoods, micro-enterprise, microfinance, credit availability are key components of any way forward that's going to take a decade at least, but which all of us in this room have a stake in seeing its success. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. If anyone would like to step up to ask a question, we'd ask you to do it from the microphones.
Jeff Hughes from Lulu International. We were talking about education just recently in the El Paso Times. 10 largest donors for education, Bill Gates being number one with $200 million. But they came up with a number of $500 million. That's our 10 largest foundations. Do we have any idea of a number of what we'd be talking about education-wise? I've lived in Mexico and dealt in Mexico for the last 25 years, and education has always just been abysmal there.
I don't have the numbers for Mexico. In the case of Salvador, 5.6% of the national budget goes to education. The average length of schooling is 4 years. You don't get enough education to participate in the contemporary life. How much is needed? I prefer not to put so much a dollar figure as a commitment by communities and corporations and foundations and those with the means to work with a section of their society to commit themselves to seeing successful, educated young men and women. Then let's talk about a total, because I think it's going to sort of scare us all off. Let's talk about ways in which each of us can support.
Hello. I was wondering, early in your presentation, you said that you wanted to know if you could apply your hypothesis from Central America to Mexico. And I was wondering, how do we apply that hypothesis, specifically the focus on fixing dysfunctional families and lack of school, to Mexico, where characteristically at the level of organized crime, the gang is not just a secondary or mob family, yet very much a biological family effort, and the knowledge gained with the gang one's education. And further, when corruption bleeds through via family networking into legal and political framework, how can the government create distance from its civilian body where the gangs no longer can manipulate the law as if it was its own playground?
You read that very fast.
Sorry.
So I'm not sure I caught the second half. But you've got a comment, and I think your comment is right on point. The second half, you have to say again slower, sorry.
I'm sorry. I guess I'm wondering, how is it that the government can deal with corruption bleeding into its political and legal framework via the family? For me, what I perceive is that in Mexico specifically, because family networking and corruption bleeds into the political system, one can, if one is in a cartel, maneuver through the government as if it was your playground, and the government isn't something that you fear as an entity distant from yourself.
I'd like to take that as a very acute and important comment. It goes to the old structures in Mexico and the monopolistic form of protecting your group, whether it's through family connections, godparent connections, and other ways in which the elite have succeeded in maintaining their power.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Salvador Penchola, and I would just like to comment very briefly on a couple of the things and then ask you a general question. You mentioned the social committees in Nicaragua, I think at the start of your presentation. It kind of reminds me of what Tito did in Yugoslavia when, although he was communist, he kept the place under control. And when communism crumbled, you began having ethnic cleansing between the Christians and the Muslims and back and forth. You also mentioned the telephone justice, which at least my Mexicano roots would say that person either has palanca or he has lana. And you just, that's the way just, basically take care of it. If you've got power, you take care of it. You mentioned jobs, and we need to call Juan or whoever to get a job for Pepito or whomever. And we used to do that in this country with unions because the job would go from the father or the uncle, whatever, to the son or the grandson or the nephew. And those jobs, unfortunately, unions don't have that kind of palanca anymore like they used to. And basically, when you discuss the commitment that needs to be made in these countries, say either in Mexico or in El Salvador, or with the police and the being retrained, the total amount of money that needs to be done, the same thing with the investigation, the equipment, and then the professional training for the lawyers and the justices and whatever, witness protection programs. We've done some of that in the United States, and we've done it in Mexico to a certain degree. And how much of this stuff, unless if you're willing to make that, or the people need to make that 15-year commitment, a 2-generational commitment, we've tried to make that here. And you've still got gangs like the Bloods and the Crips in LA and other gangs, the Brookings here in El Paso. And are we willing to make that commitment? We're a people that we want something now. We want a result now. We don't want a result in 15 years. And I don't know if we politically have the acumen to go through one or two, not only generations, but the different political parties and funding ups and downs. Are we going to make this commitment? And it's so much easier to say, well, here's X billion dollars. We made our commitment. Bye.
We can't say.
And unfortunately, I think that's what happens. But maybe maybe we can go into that a little bit. Thank you.
Right. Well, you are so right in identifying the efforts which various police forces have made. Phoenix, LA, New York, Boston. These police forces have over time developed skills to combat and contain gangs. We're very familiar with gangs. But one of the most useful legislative tools we have in the United States is the RICO, whereby you only need two elements. You need a crime committed by one person, let's say a bank robbery, combined with proof of association with two or more others. They drove the car. That is enough to put the whole group in jail under the RICO provisions. And we have used those provisions to really clean up gangs and gang violence in the United States. We've used RICO most recently up in Northern Virginia on the outskirts of Washington, where I come from, to clean up the murders. But that particular piece of legislation is not yet known, is not yet used in Mexico. Now, to this length of time, there's no alternative. You either stick with it or you emigrate. Well, the rich can emigrate, but most of us can't. Most people just have to sit there. But they shouldn't be sitting there. There should be a way in which, through your community, whether it be through your professional association, your church, the Boy Scouts, your training associations within that community, you bring your skills and your energy to bear to engage with that part of your society which is alienated and turned criminal.
Realizing that Mexico is not your principal area of focus, thinking about your remarks about Colombia, underlying, of course, so much of the Mexican problem is the drug trade. Thinking about what you said about Colombia, do you see realistically a chance for Mexico to improve its lot in these respects with the drug trade continuing, or do you have any remarks to make in that respect, please?
I'm not off the record, am I? I'm on the record. I do have them, but I've got to be a bit careful here. President Calderon talked extensively with President Uribe when he first unleashed his war on the drug cartels. I'm not sure President Calderon knew how fierce, how deep, and how prolonged this would be. He's only got 2 more years. And I don't think there's any indication that he's going to waver from it. But unless Mexican society joins in a commitment to both contain and to help prevent people joining and help them leave these criminal syndicates, there'll be a change of government in 2 years from now. I don't know what the new government, what policy they will take. Will they return to the status quo ante, where they had an accommodation? So I think Mexico is facing some very big questions as to how it wants to continue and move forward on this enterprise.
I appreciate very much your emphasizing about Guatemala and Nicaragua. looking for a non-violent system of justice and social life. And I'm just wondering about those two countries, the influence and the consequences of decisions made by our own U.S. government back in the 50s and then in the 80s. 50s in regard to Guatemala, and engineering the takeover and the changing the regime from Carabinas, Central Intelligence Agency pilots bombing the presidential palace, and in Nicaragua, the Iran conflict situation. So that we have both those countries, the families and the people coming out of that in war-torn countries, refugees, and so on, the PTSD and so on that people go through. And I saw what it was in the dictatorship in Chile a number of years there. And so I'm wondering, what would be your appraisal too of the consequences of those actions a number of years ago on the present situation of all these lost people coming from lost families who came from situations of refugee and bombardments and so on, and losing their elected governments and having other regimes imposed. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not convinced that the overthrow of our events in '54 has resulted in the present failure within the Guatemalan state. I think the close to 3 generations provides us with an alternate context that we have to look at. And that context could be the civil war of the 80s. But it could also be the infusion of drugs, drug money, which for the most part is being shipped through on its way to the US or on its way to West Africa and then Europe. And the infusion of, I'm not going to say easy money, but lots of money on scales which local communities have never seen, provides new impetuses, which maybe changes the goodness of ordinary Guatemalans. I was down in Villanueva, which is a part of Guatemala City, last year, June of 2008. And the police were telling me that the syndicates, the drug syndicates, offer between 4,000 and 5,000 quetzales. Quetzal is a little less than $1 a month to a policeman. That is 10 times his salary. And if this new money starts circulating among your state officials, how do you resist it? How do you turn down being able to pay off the debt, buy medicines for your family, finish the roof on the house? It all becomes possible when these sums of money come through. And can you not say, well, this may be illicit money for somebody, but for me, it's the debts, the roof, the medicines. So I think that the quantity of this money has a corrupting effect among good men and women. And I think we have to look to that more contemporary context rather than look back in the historical past. Thank you.
Let me once again thank Diana Negroponte for spending time with us, for traveling to El Paso and joining us here. It's been wonderful to have her here, and this is a small token of our appreciation. Thank you so much. And there will be a reception as always, in the lobby, and so there'll be an opportunity. It'll be brief, but there will be an opportunity to interact informally with each other and with our guest speaker. Thank you for coming.